How are you, my friend?
I'm great. How are you?
I am good. Good to be talking with you.
Great to talk with you. We have about 20 people here who we just did a little synergetic geometry. And as you already know, your talk that you gave in the Garden of Eden, that 25-minute thing, was the inspiration for us to meet and talk about Synergy, the love story, especially in the context of a week that saw this election and the death of Leonard Cohen. So, we'll let you riff.
And everybody else there can hear the audio?
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah, they're in the theater, in comfortable seats, looking at you.
All right. Well, nice to meet everybody. What have you covered so far? So I have a little context as I'm just joining you guys. You have some momentum already.
Well, we sang Suzanne together, which was a really nice beginning, and talked about it as being perhaps thinking of it from the standpoint that Suzanne was the Statue of Liberty, instead of a woman, that this was about our country. And she feeds you tea and oranges that come all the way from China, and just when you want to tell her that you have no love to give her, she gets you on her wavelength and she lets the river answer. So then we did a subjective thing to one of Leonard Cohen's pieces of music. I wish there was a treaty we could sign. Only it was just an instrumental, and we looked at each other's eyes with the Mayan idea of, you are another me. And that was for just 3.5 minutes, and people shared their experience about seeing many faces in one face, or about background and foreground. And so we've had that experience and that sharing leading into the Zoom tool, which gets you to not think in planes and solids, to think in terms of triangles and angles. And so everybody worked in 2 separate teams, building structures, just getting a feel for that. So that's really kind of where we are at this moment. With the idea that something may be emerging in this moment that wants to be born, that's never been before, and that right now we can't use our dominant, the dominant worldview to anticipate what that is that might be emergent, but it has to do with a mutual awakening and being together and experiencing each other and the world from a subjective place instead of from an objective place. Does that help?
Yeah, definitely. Good. So can I just kind of share what comes top of mind since we're riffing as you share all that?
Yeah.
Okay. Rather than say from a subjective instead of an objective place, then I would like for us to say we want to have depth of subjective awareness, depth of intersubjective awareness and process, and depth of objective and interobjective understanding, and bring those all together because those are all subsets of reality. And it's very easy to take a compensatory point of view to go to the other side of the pendulum swing, but then we aren't actually modeling what is relevant. We're modeling the compensation against what was imbalanced, and then the next generation has to model what's relevant, which is synthesis. In a classic Hegelian thesis, antithesis, synthesis, what that triangle is going to represent, there's a higher point, which is, I remember it was a point that was very kind of clear to me early on in my both activism and science interest, was, I think I was probably 11, and I was at a protest, and I saw people who had extremely wide values and cared about all sentient beings and were willing to risk themselves, but their strategic tools were picket signs and songs, which is cool. But then I was working on mathematics and physics and technology that was coming out of the military-industrial complex, and they had much more narrow values of what they wanted to optimize and where they were willing to externalize harm, but they were working with supercomputers and the cutting edge of what Bucky called the tools of intellectual advantage. And one of the things that I think Bucky did a good job of was actually being a technologist and being a scientist that was working on design science that had no externality. And so when I saw the Greenpeace and Standing Rock, et cetera, kind of protests, and then saw NSA, it was very clearly kind of what you could see as a head-heart divide at the level of humanity that was existential. And that as long as those with the wide values don't organize with the same kind of strategic capabilities and scientific and technological capabilities that those who are coordinating for oil or military or pharma or whatever other goals are, then we don't make it. And so the depth of subjective practice and the depth of intersubjective practice that attunes us to the suffering and the dreams of others, right? And not just human others, but all others. And that attunes us to our commonality with others and our differences, which makes the others non-fungible and infinitely precious. All of that is motive for how to act. But what's going to be able to act at scale to address the issues we have at scale is going to involve technological solutions and macroeconomic solutions and governance solutions that will be technologically mediated. And the kind of resource-based economy that Bucky foreshadowed required the kind of data science that was necessary to inventory all the world's resources and inventory all of the needs that we would allocate resources to, and complex metric systems of what we're trying to optimize, and complex data processing, complexity processing to look at how all the different issues affect each other. Where having all those things together, we can look at how to optimally allocate all the world's resources to meet all the needs, to optimize all the metrics that matter simultaneously. But it's not just a care thing, that's a care modulated through know-how. And so I would say one of the key definitions of if you want to use this word, an integral level of development, an integral worldview, is reconciling false dichotomies and including and transcending all the partial truths, which means you have to come to a higher dimensional perspective, right? And so in flatland, I can't understand a cylinder in 2 dimensions. So I either see a circle if I slice it like this, or I see a rectangle if I slice it like this, and those are uncommensuratable perspectives. And so then I can say, I can fight over which one in a fundamentalist way. I can flip-flop between partial views that both compel me at different times. I can give up on understanding and say universe is paradoxical. Or I can say take a middle path and try and make a rounded rectangle that is kind of a squished version of the 2 partial perspectives that isn't actually even partially true. Or I can jump to a higher degree of understanding in which, it's actually a 3-dimensional object. There is no 2-dimensional way to co-construct these orthonormal slices of it. But in 3rd dimension, it's actually a totally simple thing, right? It's a simple thing to understand. There are so many things like that. So when you look at the recent elections, the communist platform, the libertarian, the capitalist platform, we're kind of in a dichotomy around communion and agency in terms of whole long theory, Arthur Koestler kind of framing of it. So it's, do we want to maximize the agency of individuals, or do we want to make the best commons that conditions individuals? It's a dumb question to even frame it as fundamentally dichotomous, but we do because we haven't closed all the cause and effect feedback loops. So it seems like the way we did communism limited the agency of individuals, and the way we've done capitalism externalizes all this harm to the commons. But the truth is, all the harm to the commons is then harming the individuals even who are succeeding within capitalism. And the way that you diminish the agency of individuals diminishes the quality of the collective that they're in. So it's just neither of those were good at their own values. And if you want to optimize maximum individual agency and maximum collective inter-well-being, you'd maximize them exactly the same way that 50 trillion cells in a human body do. But it requires a more complex set of factoring all the feedback loops and a higher dimensional kind of reckoning of it. And so one of the things that I would offer as a design science challenge and part of the process is go deep into our own subjective to just feel what it's like to exist, and the experiential difference between versions of suffering and versions of well-being, and there's actually an evolutionary motive axis built into our sentience, and then take that and tune into that in everybody else, and tune into the opportunities for self-actualization that are under-realized everywhere, and all of the suffering where there are so many people and beings that are in situations of suffering who literally can't do anything about it themselves. Animals cannot get themselves out of a factory farm. And the kid who was born into Somalia, into poverty, can't get themselves out of it. And so there's some kinds of cause and effect that only make sense collectively. If we try and explain that that kid or that animal is fully responsible for their reality, it just doesn't. We have to say they were bad in a past life, or they chose that suffering for some nonsensical reason, some weird metaphysics, or it just doesn't make any sense. And the answer is, we don't live in a world where we create 100% of our reality. We influence things, but we don't change the gravitational constant or Planck's constant. We don't, it is a co-creative, co-unfolding process. And so the fact that I wasn't born into the factory farm is not because I'm better. I was more fortunate, right, than that animal was. But then the fact that they can't get themselves out and I can means that I'm automatically, there's a sacred obligation that I have to apply myself to those things. And the deep inner subjective sensing into the subjectivity of others is what guides that motive, right? But then when I say, okay, it's really obsolete factory farming, or what does it really take to obsolete war or to change macroeconomics such that poverty doesn't exist, I have to leave just caring about stuff and get into very deep know-how, both systems design, what are the right systems, and then the tactics of how do we get those systems implemented. And so I would encourage everyone there to explore, how do you bring together scientific and technological and strategic thinking with Omni Considerate Values, so that our care, as it deepens, can actually translate into greater effect towards what we think about.
Yeah, that would be a great thing for us to work on in small groups, is that question. And actually, as an experience of being there and operating from that place, speaking from that place as we shared that, so then that is the integration of the objective aspects that need to be developed and scaled up with this deep subjective experience of the sentience of all of life on the planet, and to speak from that place, or to give us an opportunity to lean into the synergy that could unfold if that was how we were beginning to address the difficulties and challenges that we're facing in this moment.
Yeah. I'm going to share another thought which might be unpopular. I don't know the worldview of the group that I'm speaking to. But I'm speaking as someone who has been motivated by the existential devastation of feeling the amount of pain in the world from having worked in frontline poverty, animal rights issues, environmental issues, and did the prayers of Bodhisattva for so many years to take on everyone's experience. One thing I'll say is that we actually have to limit our own subjective experience sometimes. Because if you were just real about it, if there's one other person who's in so much suffering that they pretty much can't make it, and we try and think, well, I'm going to take that on, and then there's two, and then there's thousands of them, well, it's almost like egotistical, grandiose to think I could really feel all that at all, right? Not be crushed. So what I'm doing is I'm feeling my imagine into it, a bit of it, but then I need to not go into hopelessness or devastation or anger, all of which are not useful to what we care about. We need to translate it hurts because we love the actual preciousness of life. And then how, for me, if I don't then look at how can I actually be effective towards helping that quality of sentient experience, I don't feel better. And I don't know that anybody really does. And so then there's a discipline to say, how do we translate the, empathy and whatever kind of empathic pain we feel into really motivated, strategic, capable action. And that actually requires an emotional shift. It requires an emotional shift from pain into not anger or overwhelm or depression, but into love that is underneath why there's pain, and then from love into passion and motivation and focus.
So speak a little bit about what that shift would require. How do you move into that? What practice or what form might it take?
I'll give a couple of examples. I think Elon Musk is a real good, timely example where he looked around and saw what looked like existential risks humanity was facing. That we had in the very near term a number of different possibilities of self-induced extinction. And so that kind of was like, there's nothing else that's all that meaningful if we haven't addressed that yet, because we might lose the whole playing ground, right? And so then for him, he was like, all right, well, how can I address this? And there's two big things. What are the most likely causes of existential risk? And he assessed climate change. And so then Tesla and Hyperloop and Solar City, and batteries were all, how do we actually get the world off of, and this was so much deeper than carbon taxes, right? This was, how do we actually create a technological solution, which Bucky would have liked, that actually just makes fossil fuels obsolete. But then actually doing it, right? And thinking about how much study and action and failure and reaction again happen to be able to get there. And then in case we don't make it on this planet, having humanity's only stand not be on this planet is SpaceX and his work to get us, onto Mars. And people can think of him almost like they thought of Bucky in an almost superhuman kind of way, but it's just actually getting clear enough on the motive and then following the principles of effectiveness. And so with SpaceX, he's been accomplishing, as a self-funded company, something that all of the countries of the world have been failing at. That's a big deal, right? Like, we haven't done anything with spaceflight in a long time, and now he's got a realistic process happening to get us to Mars because he was just motivated enough, and then actually following through on the actions enough. And how he's succeeding now, he did not know when he started, but he fully committed and was independent of a specific how, which means that when it was the wrong how, he iterated very quickly, rather than said, I don't know how, and then just hoped someone else figured it out. And I would say, Gandhi had a very similar story starting in South Africa and then in India, when he saw both slavery and poverty dynamics from British rule in South Africa. When he got there, and he hadn't been used to that coming from Britain before that, it just hit him so hard how wrong what he was seeing was, that he made this commitment to change it. And his friends they're asked how, he said, I have no idea, but I'm actually going to sit right here and think about how, and write about it, and meditate about it, and pray about it, and not do anything else until I have a strategy, and then I'm going to do that strategy. And then he did the strategy, and it failed. He got imprisoned, and they said, thank you, it was a nice offer. And he goes, no, I'm still going to change it. And again, he didn't know how, but I'm going to just work on a how. And he had a commitment, not just to process, but to outcome. And this is another one of those places I think we've overcompensated, where we said we're too result focused, we need to be focused on the process. If my result is I want to prevent extinction of our species, or I want to save this kid from starvation, or I give a shit about the result, I really do, right? Now I want the process to be aligned with the result, because if I'm a tyrant in the process, that's not going to work. If I lose the the experience of life in the process that I'm not really aligned with where I'm trying to go. But I don't want to lose the result for the process either. That's another one of those false circle rectangle dichotomies where you go to a higher perspective and I need to be continuously aligning process and result, right? And so I would say one of the things that happened was the result there, though, is not just a benefit itself at the expense of other result, which has been a lot of the kind of result we wanted to move away from, which was they were just actually the wrong results, right? We were seeking how do I get rich even if it's not, it's get rich to make me happy, and that's the wrong mechanism. Getting rich doesn't make you happy and probably damages a lot of things that do. But if the result I care about is actually an empathetically driven and a values level driven goal of how I want to touch the world, then who I'm being and how I show up matters, and what I actually am trying to touch matters. And so one of the things that the people I've seen influence the world the most powerfully had in common was they actually made commitments to the results, not just to the process, not to do their best. They made commitments to the results before knowing how, and then they worked their ass off on it, and every time it didn't work, they just kept working their ass off on trying another strategy, figuring it out until it did. And so that same kind of Edison light bulb principle that we think about in science and invention, I think has to be applied in civilization design equally.
Is it both and? Is it both an individual and the communities that they call together and the collaboration that they require from others and the way that they invite that's different than just agency? Is there a communal aspect to both of those examples that sometimes can be read as a strong leader rather than somebody who's got a great vision but also has empowered and invited many people to be able to collaborate on that level for that reason?
Yeah, what Gandhi did, and what Martin Luther King did was they didn't actually feel something that a lot of people hadn't felt. But then they actually gave voice to everyone who didn't know how to give voice to that well. And so then almost giving up a certain amount of individuality and speaking into the collective longing in some way was part of what made them able to rally people so much, right? Because it wasn't just, here's my vision, you want to come do it. It's like, here is clearly our collective need vision. And then the leadership they were able to serve was a strange attractor, right? It was a focus point of energy being able to direct itself. And then you have this awareness that good leaders lead people well, people want to follow and get engaged, and great leaders lead other people to get more and more sovereign in their own leadership and self-direction.
Yeah, that's the core of how, and the distinction between something that's just good and something that's really great is that empowerment piece. And that's partly what we're facing in this country at this moment in the presidency that we're anticipating.
But part of why Putin has been so successful coming out of how damaged so many things in the USSR were for the Soviet people, and part of why Donald Trump is successful here is what it takes to have a self-organized global civilization where everyone are really Omni Considerate agents for the whole and are self-governing. We're not even anywhere close to that. And we have to be realistic about, of course that's what we're working towards, but the growth curve there involves a lot of leadership. Because people grew up as kids, and as your educators, you see this, they were very rarely punished as kids when they were deeply neuroplastic and wiring how to be, and wiring at a limbic firmware level. They were very rarely punished for doing what authorities wanted them to do, right? And they were almost exclusively punished for doing what they wanted to do, that the authorities didn't want them to do, and they were almost exclusively rewarded for doing what authorities wanted them to do. And so they imprinted so deeply, not only following authority and not having their own agency, but they don't even know how to self-assess and self-initiate because they never practiced. They never learned those skills. They didn't even develop those neural circuits. And so it's not like you can just say, hey, you need to self-assess and self-initiate. It's like, what the fuck does that mean? How do I? And so what I just told you guys to do is, self-assess and self-initiate, right? Like to some degree of take that care and actually figure out how to do something with it. But people don't automatically know how to do that. And so if they see someone, for whatever reason, their life circumstances brought about that ability, they'll want to say, hey, can I add my creative energy? Because I have skills. Mm-hmm. But when I think about how do I stop, the pipeline at Standing Rock, it's not clear for most people because we didn't have an education system that brought about that kind of both agentic and community coalescing initiatory problem solving capabilities. So I would say this is a top goal for educators is how do we educate people who are not just deeply caring, empathetic, are not just brilliant problem solvers, are not just very agentic and initiatory, but all of those things.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So it's really having several priorities and the synthesis of those priorities as we educate children and as we do the work ourselves to do that.
Yep. Yeah.
Well, thank you.
Thank you.
Yay.
Deeply appreciate your time that you spent with us.
I think I'll just share one more thing is, there will be a both and here that's important, but I'll share a side that maybe is not popularly talked about. One of the things that hit me very early was that any model of success for my life that was not success for everybody else's life was incongruent, didn't make sense. And because I thought about it, I'm like, all right, so if the animals are still in the factory farm, if the rainforest is still being cut down, and if the kids are still in forced sex brothels and whatever, but I'm killing it. I'm doing really well. I'm doing science that I like. I'm doing creative stuff that I like. My money, my family's good, and I'm happy with that. I am, at least to some degree, a psychopath, right? To some degree, my empathy got turned off where I can be totally stoked in the presence of knowledge of, grotesque suffering at mass of others. And that model of success really only works for some degree of psychopathy. Mm. Now we have a system that has conditioned low-grade psychopathy into everyone. Mm-hmm. And I think it's important to get that that's one of our core aspects of systems design we want to do is how do we actually condition empathy and omni consideration and agency at the same time into everyone. Mm-hmm. So that people don't just feel empathetic and then stuck, or agentic and willing to externalize harm, but agentic for the whole. Mm-hmm. 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 Right? Powerful and initiatory for that there's no idea that they could get ahead at the expense of a world that they're interconnected with. Mm-hmm. Or even independent of it. Mm-hmm. Right? And so the balance point to that is the world's fucking beautiful right now. And it's important to be able to go outside, look at the stars, stop thinking about the elections and climate change, and just take in the beauty of existence, both because it's real and it matters in our subjective experience of how the universe is experiencing itself, and because it sources us to go back into making things better. And this is that balance of loving what is and making what is better, and it's both simultaneously. Right. But if I stay with the loving what is without work to make things better in the presence of real pain for very long periods of time, I think there's actually something wrong. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And so, and if someone's in the what's wrong exclusively without accessing the beauty of life, there's also something wrong. I think that's the dialectic.
Yeah. And it was really what Bucky meant by world game, making the world work for 100% of humanity without disadvantaging the natural world, was exactly that articulation of how to create that kind of omni consideration with agency.
And like, it's a great question, right? If the success or failure of all of humanity depended upon who I am and what I do, would I be able to do?
Yes.
in a way that seems like a egotistical question, but it's actually framing the meaning of your life question, right? Because of course we want everyone asking that question. It depends on what everyone does and how we all do it together and things beyond what we do. But I want to think about what I actually have influence over. And to the degree that it depends on what someone else does, and the question for me still is how do I help influence that? And so then it comes back here. And as much as people really take that question of Bucky seriously, I think that is key to our making it through this transition.
Great way to end. Great way to close. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you, Daniel.
Thank you.
Thank you.